This is the story of how I almost died as a kid, home alone. It was, without a doubt, the most intense night of my life, with way too much going on at once. I come from a family of 5. At the time, I was 10 years old, my older brother was 14, and my little sister was just 5. It was a Friday night, and my brother was out with his friends, causing the kind of trouble teenagers do. Then the phone call came. I was in my room playing a Star Wars video game when I suddenly heard my mom crying and freaking out. I got really scared and rushed out to see what was going on. My mom was on the phone with the hospital. They were calling to inform my parents that my brother had been hit by a car. The news shook us all to the core. My mom was crying uncontrollably, and even though I didn't know the full details, I heard something about my brother having a broken leg. That's all I could catch before my parents hurried to grab their coats and my little sister. Before leaving, they asked me if I'd be okay staying home alone. I nodded, still in shock, and they rushed out the door. I was really worried for my brother, but a part of me was relieved not to have to go to the hospital. I don't think my parents wanted me or my sister to see him in that state either. For context, my brother recovered just fine, so his injury is no longer part of this story, except for being the reason I ended up home alone that night. Before they left, my dad tried to comfort my mom, reassuring her that my brother was going to be okay. Seeing my dad calm and in control made me feel a little better. I thought maybe my mom was just being overly dramatic, like moms sometimes are in these situations. I went back to my room and continued playing my game for a couple of hours. By now it was well past midnight, and I decided to turn off the TV and PlayStation. Crawling into bed with my Game Boy, I started winding down for the night. That's when I heard the front door open. I froze. I didn't hear any voices. No, "We're home" from my parents. No sound of my brother's crutches. Nothing. I strained to listen, hoping to catch something, but the house was eerily silent. Feeling uneasy, I quietly got out of bed and crept to my bedroom door. I opened it just enough to peek out and moved toward the banister overlooking the living room. What I saw stopped me cold. There were 3 tall figures standing in the dark living room. They weren't my parents. They weren't my brother. I was petrified, frozen in place for what felt like an eternity before my instincts kicked in. I quietly backed away, slipping back into my room, and shut the door as softly as I could. But even soft wasn't quiet enough. I knew they must have heard the faint click of the door closing. My heart was pounding as I opened my closet door, stepped inside, and hid behind a pile of boxes and bags stuffed in there. I crouched down, holding my breath, praying I was hidden well enough. Then I heard it, the sound of my bedroom door opening. Footsteps entered the room. I couldn't tell how many. It might have been 1 person, or maybe 2. I heard the sound of my bedsheets being moved around like they were checking if someone was in bed. Then silence. The footsteps got closer. They stopped right in front of the closet. And then the closet door opened. I was holding my breath, my heart beating so hard I thought they'd hear it. I stayed as still as I could, crouched behind the boxes and bags, too terrified to even lift my head. The door stayed open for what felt like an eternity, 20 seconds of pure, agonizing silence. Then it closed again. Footsteps retreated out of the room, and I finally exhaled quietly, still not daring to move. It wasn't until what felt like an hour later that I finally heard my parents return. I ran downstairs, trembling and on the verge of tears. The front door was left ajar. The intruders had stolen several valuables. My parents had been in such a rush to get to the hospital earlier that they hadn't even locked the door. That night had gone from bad to worse for my family. I was lucky not to have been killed or kidnapped. To this day, I wonder if the person who opened that closet door saw me sitting there. Maybe they weren't there to hurt anyone, just to rob the house. Or maybe they didn't see me and I narrowly escaped something far worse. I'll never know. I was left home alone a lot as a kid. My mom was a single parent for most of my childhood, and she worked as a nurse on a difficult schedule. My older brother had already gone off to college, so it was just the two of us at home. On some nights like this one, I was entirely on my own. It was a weekend night and my mom was working an overnight shift. I had invited a girl named Molly over to hang out. We had been talking for a while and she came over to watch some movies. We laughed, ate snacks, and had a good time, but eventually she had to leave. Her parents didn't like her staying out too late. After she left, I was alone again, holding down the fort. I went upstairs to my room and kept watching TV in bed. My room was right next to the backyard, so it was easy to hear noises coming from outside. At some point I heard a scraping sound, like one of the chairs on our back deck being dragged across the wood. At first I thought it was nothing, but curiosity got the better of me. I got up and looked out the window. That's when I saw someone sitting on one of the chairs on the deck below. Thinking it might be Molly playing a joke on me, I called her name. She had only left about 10 minutes earlier, so it wasn't impossible. But when the person looked up at me, I realized it wasn't her. The face staring back at me didn't belong to anyone I recognized. In the darkness, I couldn't make out much, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I immediately pulled back from the window, my heart racing. Trying to make sense of what I had just seen, I texted a few of my friends in a group chat, asking if any of them were messing with me. The ones who replied said no and wanted to know what was going on. I didn't really think any of them would pull a stunt like this, but I was desperate for answers. Scared but curious, I slowly walked back to the window and peeked outside again. The person was still there, sitting in the chair and staring up at my window. It was definitely a man. He was sitting so still, almost like he was waiting for something. I panicked and moved away from the window again. I turned off the TV to make it look like no one was in the room. Sitting on my bed, I curled into a ball with my knees hugged to my chest. I didn't want to move or make a sound. The window was open and I was terrified he'd hear me or see any light from my phone if I turned it on. Minutes passed, each one feeling longer than the last. I told myself there was no way he could still be out there. Summoning what little courage I had, I got up and looked out at the window again. He was still there. This time I felt a chill run through my entire body. He was sitting in the same spot, staring up at me, unmoving. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought he might hear it. Instead of hiding again, I decided to confront him. I leaned out slightly and called down, "What do you want?" He didn't respond immediately. Then his shoulders began to move up and down. At first I thought he was crying, but I quickly realized he was laughing. The eerie part? He wasn't making any noise, just wheezing softly. The sound sent shivers down my spine. "Please, just go away," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. But he didn't leave. He just kept sitting there, his shoulders still shaking with silent laughter. I couldn't take it anymore and backed away from the window, pulling the curtains shut. I tried to think of what to do. Should I call the police? My fear of him hearing me or seeing the light from my phone kept me frozen in place. I decided to leave my room and sat at the top of the stairs, trying to listen for any signs of him leaving. That's when I heard the sound of the back door handle being jiggled. He was trying to get inside. I ran back to my room, my hands shaking as I locked the door. My mind was racing. I was only 14, skinny and small, with no idea how to defend myself. I felt completely helpless. Then, I heard him at the front door. He was fiddling with the knob, pushing on it like he thought it might just open if he tried hard enough. My heart stopped. If our doors hadn't been locked, he could have walked right in. Thankfully, he gave up after a few minutes. I didn't dare move from my room for the rest of the night. I shut the window tightly and made sure the curtains were completely closed. Sitting on my bed, I waited in silence, jumping at every little sound. I didn't sleep at all. When my mom got home around 9 in the morning, I ran downstairs and told her everything. I expected her to comfort me or be worried, but instead she was angry. "Why didn't you call 911?" she demanded. Looking back now, I realize how stupid it was not to call for help. At the time, I was too scared to think clearly. I was afraid of making noise, afraid of drawing attention to myself. But my decision not to act could have cost me my life. To this day, I still think about that night. Who was that man? Why was he there? And what would have happened if I hadn't locked the doors? Those questions still haunt me even years later. I share a 2-story house with my sister. It's a mother-daughter house, meaning it has 2 separate living areas, each with its own kitchen. My sister lives downstairs and I take the upstairs. She isn't home much though, because she spends a lot of time at her boyfriend's place, which is about 20 miles away. I'm 30 years old, and I like to think I'm not someone who gets easily freaked out. But I'll admit, being home alone in a big house can feel unsettling sometimes, especially late at night. This happened on one of those nights when I was home alone. I was in my living room watching a scary movie. My part of the house has an open layout, so the living room, dining room, and kitchen are all in one big space. My couch is positioned in the middle of the room, which means when I sit on it to watch TV, my back is to a large open area. Even though I like scary movies, I'll admit that sitting in the dark, with my back to all that empty space, made me a little uneasy. The only light in the room came from the TV, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than I'd like to admit. Once the movie ended, I brushed my teeth, turned off all the lights, and went to bed. I fell asleep quickly, but a couple of hours later, around 1 a.m., I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why I'd woken up. Then I heard it. A voice coming from downstairs. It sounded like my sister's voice. The strange thing was that it didn't sound like she was outside the house calling for me to open the door. It sounded like she was already inside. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but I was still groggy and not thinking clearly. My first thought was that maybe she was arguing with her boyfriend or trying to get my attention. I got out of bed and stepped into the dark hallway. Turning on the hallway light, I made my way through the living room, listening for her voice. I heard it again. This time it was clear. She was calling my name. I called back, "What is it?" But there was no response. Convinced she was downstairs, I walked down the steps in the dark, still groggy. I reached for the light switch in the foyer but couldn't seem to find it. Frustrated, I moved further into her part of the house, fumbling for a switch. Finally, I found one in her kitchen and turned it on. The light flickered to life, dim at first, then slowly brightened, illuminating her kitchen and living room. But there was no one there. No sister, no boyfriend. Confused, I walked to her bedroom to check. It was empty too. "What's going on?" I muttered to myself. Then I called her name again, louder this time. Still no answer. Just as I was about to head back upstairs, I heard it. A loud thud coming from her bedroom. My heart jumped. I had just checked that room and it was completely empty. Frozen in place, I stared at the bedroom door, unsure of what to do. Finally, my fear got the better of me, and I bolted back up the stairs, just like a scared little kid. Once I was back in my room, I locked the door and grabbed my phone. I called my sister several times, but she didn't pick up. I sat there in bed, clutching my phone, my mind racing. Had I imagined it all? Was I dreaming? Or was there someone or something else in the house? I didn't have the courage to go back downstairs. Instead, I stayed locked in my room, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up to a text from my sister. "Why did you call me at 1 a.m.?" she asked. I immediately texted her back, asking if she'd been home the night before. Her reply sent a chill down my spine. "No," she said. "I was at my boyfriend's place." Still shaken, I went downstairs to her bedroom to check for anything that might have caused the noise I'd heard. I searched the room thoroughly, but there was nothing out of place. No objects on the floor, no signs that anything had fallen. I tried to tell myself that I must have hallucinated the whole thing, but deep down I wasn't so sure. I've never hallucinated before, and I don't have any history of sleep disorders. The way I vividly heard her voice and the sound of something falling, it felt too real to be imagined. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. I want to believe it was all in my head because the alternative is far more terrifying. I'm 23 years old and still live at home with my parents. One day, both of them were out, leaving me home alone. I decided to spend some time outside, playing basketball in the front yard. As I was playing, something made me glance up at one of the upstairs windows. That's when I saw her, a woman standing there staring down at me. She wasn't my mom or my sister. In fact, she wasn't anyone I recognized. The moment our eyes met, she quickly moved out of view, disappearing from the window. My heart started racing. Who was that? Why was she in our house? I dropped the basketball and ran inside. I headed straight upstairs to check the lounge room where I'd seen her, but it was empty. Determined to figure out what was going on, I searched every single room upstairs. I checked my parents' bedroom, my sister's room, my own room, the bathroom, and every closet. Nothing. Then I made my way downstairs to search there too. I looked through the living room, kitchen, dining room, a bedroom, and all the closets. Still nothing. Finally, I headed to the basement. I didn't think she'd be down there. It's a small space with only a couple of couches, a bar, and 2 closets. There aren't many places to hide, but I had to be sure. I opened the first closet, bracing myself for what I might find. Nothing. Then I turned to the second closet. My anxiety spiked as I grabbed the handle. This was the last place she could possibly be. I yanked the door open quickly, like ripping off a Band-Aid. Immediately, I pushed myself into the closet, hoping to catch her off guard if she was in there. But all I found were coats and hangers. Nothing else. Confused and more than a little scared, I stood there for a moment trying to process what had just happened. I knew I'd seen that woman in the window. It wasn't something I could have imagined. It was too real. I went back to the middle floor and did the only thing I could think of. I screamed. I yelled as loud as I could, telling whoever was in the house to get out. My shouting must have been loud enough to get attention because a few minutes later, my next-door neighbor came over looking concerned. He asked if I was okay, so I told him what had happened, that I'd seen a strange woman standing at the window upstairs. He came inside and helped me search the house again. We looked everywhere, just like I had before, but we couldn't find her. In the end, we both assumed she must have slipped out through the back door. I remembered I'd left it unlocked earlier when I went to grab the basketball from the yard. Once my neighbor was satisfied that the house was clear, he left, and I locked all the doors. Then I called my parents to tell them what had happened. They weren't exactly thrilled, but they asked me to check if anything had been stolen. I went through the house, checking everything valuable, but nothing seemed to be missing. That night I did another quick check of the house before going to bed. Even though everything seemed fine, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. My mind was racing as I lay in bed, struggling to fall asleep. Eventually, I started to drift off, but then I heard a sound. It wasn't loud at first, just subtle noises coming from the other side of my room. I had the ceiling fan on, so the room wasn't completely silent, which is probably why I didn't notice the noise right away. But as I listened more closely, I realized the sounds were human-like. I turned to look and my blood ran cold. There she was, the same woman I'd seen in the window, crawling out from under my bed. She stood up, towering over me as I froze in shock. Then, instinct took over. I screamed louder than I'd ever screamed in my life and jumped out of bed. Without thinking, I tackled her to the floor, pinning her down. I grabbed her by the throat, demanding to know who she was and what she wanted. But before she could answer, or before I could process what was happening, the doorbell rang. It was my neighbor again. With adrenaline pumping through my veins, I dragged the woman to the front door, ignoring her struggles and the scratches she was leaving on my arms. I still have scars on my right arm from that night. I opened the door and my neighbor stepped in to help me restrain her. While we held her down, I called the police. The whole time we waited for them to arrive, the woman was screaming, cursing, and even threatening us. She looked rough, dirty, disheveled, and clearly out of her mind. My neighbor and I guessed she was on drugs, probably meth. When the police arrived, one of the officers recognized her immediately. He said they'd dealt with her multiple times before. Her name was Karen, which almost felt ironic given the situation. Watching her get handcuffed and taken to the back of the police car was oddly satisfying. After everything settled down, I thanked my neighbor for coming to my rescue. Not once, but twice. That night, I couldn't fall asleep, but my mind wasn't entirely consumed by fear anymore. There was something else, an overwhelming feeling of satisfaction. I still can't fully explain it, but knowing that she wouldn't be able to hurt anyone else made me feel just a little better. When I was a teenager, I had the house to myself for an entire week. My parents rarely went out, so this was a pretty big deal. My mom's wealthy friend, Patty, had invited them on a trip, and since I'm an only child, I stayed behind. We lived in Newark, Ohio, specifically in Licking County. Yes, Licking County. My parents' house was in a quiet area with woods in the backyard. The road we lived on was so quiet, only a few cars would pass by each day. We had a huge deck overlooking the woods, a decent-sized backyard, a fish pond, and an above-ground swimming pool. It was a Thursday night in July 2013, and I was out on the deck smoking weed and listening to music. I had plans with friends for the weekend and was feeling pretty relaxed. That's when it started. I thought I heard a voice coming from the woods. I paused the music and listened closely. At first, there was nothing, so I turned the music back on. But then I heard it again, a voice calling out from the woods. I turned the music off completely and stood still, listening carefully. The voice came again. It was a male voice, distant but not too far away. It was saying, "Hey, over here." The woods were only 20 to 30 yards from the deck, and that's where the voice was coming from. At first I thought it might be kids playing games, like Manhunt or something. But then the voice called out again, louder this time. "Hey, over here, we need help." Hearing someone call for help is always unsettling, but now I was starting to feel uneasy. The voice was deep, not a kid's voice, and it sounded serious. I stood there, debating whether to respond. Then the voice yelled, "Straight in front of you, please, come help us." Now I was sure it was directed at me. Reluctantly, I called back, "Who is that?" The voice responded immediately, "We just need help. We're stuck in the woods." "What does that mean?" I asked, confused. "Just please come help, straight in front of you." Hesitantly, I got up from my seat and walked down the deck steps onto the grass. I started moving toward the woods and called out, "I'm coming, where are you?" The voice replied, "Right in front of you, I see you." That's when I stopped in my tracks. A bad feeling settled in my gut. Something wasn't right. I called back, "Wait, are you alone or is someone with you?" This time, there was no answer. My unease turned to full-on alarm. I started walking backward, away from the woods, keeping my eyes on them the whole time. I didn't even want to turn my back. When I reached the deck, I realized how suspicious this whole situation was. If they could see me, why didn't they say anything when I walked away? If they really needed help, why weren't they more desperate? The whole stuck in the woods thing didn't make any sense either. How could someone be stuck in the woods if they could see me? What? Was their shirt caught on a branch? I went back inside the house, locked all the doors, and tried to calm down. I sat in the living room for a while, still a little high, which probably explained why I'd been so trusting at first. But now, paranoia was creeping in. That's when I heard the voice again. This time, it wasn't coming from the woods, it was closer, definitely in the backyard. Then I heard splashing. It could have been from the pool or the fish pond. I rushed to the window and peeked out. At first, I didn't see anything. Then the voice called out again, laughing this time, "I see you." I froze. Finally, I spotted him. A man was partially hidden behind the pool. I could only see his head, but it was too dark to make out his face. He had medium-length dark hair. I closed the blinds quickly, hoping he'd lose interest if he thought I wasn't paying attention. I figured he was just some deranged person messing with me, and I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. But then came the breaking point. There was a loud, aggressive bang on the window, the same one where I just closed the blinds. The man was screaming now, shouting behind him, "Help!" I snapped. I screamed at the top of my lungs, "Get the Hawkins out of here, you freak! The police are coming!" I yelled it over and over, trying to sound as unhinged as possible. Instead of being scared off, he started laughing. His laughter was loud and unsettling, but eventually, it faded. I assumed he was walking away. When everything went quiet, I collapsed onto the couch, shaking and out of breath. My heart was racing, and I couldn't stop trembling. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to calm down. It seemed like the guy had finally given up. Despite everything, I ended up sleeping okay that night, thanks to the weed. But the whole experience left me shaken. Looking back, I wonder if I would have handled things differently if I hadn't been high. Either way, that night made me a lot more cautious about who I trust and who I open my door to.